Emissaries is a trilogy of simulations, live simulations, all in the same landscape but many thousands of years apart. And the real property that I wanted to explore was creating a program so that you never had a beginning and end. It was a process that was ongoing as life is ongoing. So I came across this book called On the Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes, I think around 2010. And it struck me as a very radical kind of book. It came out in the late 70s, but its premise to me was still very alien and radical. And Julian Jaynes hypothesized that humans weren't always conscious. They were, in a way, kind of like automatons up until as early as 3,000 years ago. And when they ran into a problem or a stressful situation which their life experience and their habits couldn't resolve, you and I today would kind of think about it, imagine the possible stories of what our life would be like if we went down this route versus that route. But he says that ancient humans instead heard a voice, and that voice told them what to do. And the voice often sounded like their mom or their dad or the village leader, or eventually what they perceived to be the gods. And he said this voice was the way in which people solved their problems under stress for many thousands of years, and that ability was almost, if you can think of it as a kind of app. Like our brains are sort of like an iPhone, and their iPhone in ancient times was like iPhone 1.0, and now we have iPhone like 10.0 with the app of consciousness, but the app of consciousness didn't exist for them, and instead they had to rely on these voices. But of course, reality became more and more complex. When people were dealing with ecological disaster, they had to migrate and they became refugees, and this is a very difficult thing to do, especially in ancient times, and different people with different voices would conflict with each other, meet each other, and then come into conflict about which voices were really true. And his hypothesis is that over time, this new app emerged called consciousness, which is a way to project yourself forward in time or backwards in time in order to resolve your stress. I don't know if it's true, but it's certainly weird, and it definitely captured my imagination for making these works called Emissaries. So I've been very interested in artificial intelligence since I was an undergrad, and I very much wanted to figure out a way to integrate that into what I do as an artist. And I was very interested in Emissaries to kind of create my own model of the mind to make the different agents, the different characters in the simulations react in ways that are much more legible to us. Not necessarily intelligent, but like a kind of a stupid dog, or like the way ants move. I really wanted it to capture something more true to nature than a kind of chaotic system that was devoid of intelligence. And I thought of this model that rather than trying to find the unified theory of what consciousness is or how to make the perfect AI, which I'm not Google, so far be it for me to even attempt that, I decided that a much more interesting approach would be to collage together different models of the brain, both from philosophy but also from computer science and video games, and to have those models compete inside each of the characters' heads. So for example, there's a threat model that's based on how maybe first-person shooter video games, their AI is modeled. There's a kind of needs model based on how The Sims did their AI in terms of their need for hunger, thirst, need to sleep, all these kind of slightly urgent but not super urgent behaviors. And then there's a narrative model, which is, I think, really close to the Julian Jaynes idea that narrative consciousness was an emergent thing that came after these other lower forms of, not lower forms, but more immediate and primitive forms of making sense of the world. And so you put all these three things in one head, and it's like that movie Inside Out, where you have these competing agents inside yourself. You have multiple people inside of you, and they're all fighting for control, but only one of them gets a spotlight at a time. It kind of uses the analogy of a Congress or like a parliament. You only get one speaker at a time, and that person for that moment takes control of the whole room. And in the case of like Inside Out or the simulations, that model takes control of the whole character, and it's behaving under those conditions, but then can very well be pushed aside and taken over by someone else. It's a bit like also when you're hungry, you get hangry. And when you get hangry, you turn into a different person. You're no longer your benevolent self. You're no longer someone who can think deeply or make a joke. You just want food. And I very much thought this was really true to nature, but hadn't been seen in either video games or in more academic studies of artificial intelligence. So this was my plot or my plan for how Emissary should unfold. It was basically about this composition of the mind that was strung through each of the episodes. The first simulation, called Emissary and the Squad of Gods, takes place on the side of a volcano, and the ancient community is faced with the threat of a volcanic eruption. The volcano hasn't erupted and lava hasn't flowed yet, but they feel the tremors of it, and the tremors become a threat because they don't know whether to leave and uproot their home or to stay and kind of call the bluff of the volcano. The Emissary is this little girl, it's the daughter of the shaman, and she gets hit in the head by some debris from one of the tremors. And when she gets hit in the head, she actually stops hearing the voices that the father hears and instead begins to think in a way independently on her own outside the community. The simulation follows her entirely as she tries to convince everyone to leave, but in the process, because there's so many narrative goals happening that involve other characters who are very reactive, oftentimes she does not succeed, or oftentimes they recruit her into doing whatever it is they need to do. The scene you're seeing with the Emissary and the snake boy is always for me a very interesting moment, because the snake boy, his character is to want to mansplain to her what the snakes are doing. So he's always trying to talk over her, and she's trying to warn him this volcano is going to hit, but he keeps trying to tell her that these snakes are the most important thing in the world and she needs to understand and listen to him. And it's really, I think, quite satisfying for myself when the snake boy gets like run over by a pile of ash, being obsessed with the snakes. And so she often becomes distracted by them. And this, for me, is part of the pleasure of watching this simulation. I've set up this narrative premise and I've set up her goals, but for me as an artist, it's also an exercise in really losing control and not being overly deterministic about what a viewer sees. So the second simulation, Emissary, Forks of Perfection, takes place thousands of years later, and the volcano is turned into a kind of crater lake, a dormant volcano, where the interior edge of the volcano has become this kind of fertile Darwinian paradise, and it's bred these kind of mutant dogs. They look like Shiba dogs, and in the landscape you see many kinds of failed experiments of this dog. The premise of this simulation is that one day this AI discovers the dead body of a 21st century human. The AI resurrects this human but can only make the human live for roughly 20 minutes. And instead of greeting the human itself, thinking that a human could never fully understand and relate to the AI, it sends its best Shiba dog, I call it the Shiba Emissary, to go greet this 21st century human. And thinking that the Shiba and the human would have and rekindle this lifelong relationship between man and dog. And so the Shiba Emissary's goal and mission is to extract the memories of the 21st century human for the AI. But of course it's a dog, and of course a dog loves humans, and so the dog can't help but be seduced and fall in love with the human again, and often in a way self-sabotages its own mission because of its love for this person. So the final episode of Emissaries is called Emissary Sunsets the Self, and again it's in the same landscape as the first two Emissaries, but perhaps billions of years in the future, so far in the future where the AI has become not even an entity, but a substance, almost like utility, like water or gas. In the Umin, it's decided that they're going to be the immune system for the landscape. Almost like your cells are inside your body, it's created a kind of organism or a pack of organisms that are very reactive to threats and want to expunge any kind of radical mutation. But it kind of got so bored with that idea that it decided to send a little part of itself down onto the terrestrial plane and it kind of possess this plant. And as it possesses the plant, it starts to fall in love with life again. It starts to kind of feel all the sensations of life and starts to gather up other plants to kind of give it more agency. But from the Uman's perspective, they see this as a serious threat to their existence, a serious threat to the landscape. Their mission is to expunge any radical mutations, and it's a bit like the village in Frankenstein, or how I imagine if Jesus came down and got really bored with doing miracles and being benevolent to everyone and stayed a little bit past 33 years and started just to mess around with his powers. Jesus would become a kind of enemy of the state in a way. So the main dramatic conflict of Emissary Sunsets itself is this AI's love for being alive but at the cost of being increasingly a monstrous force amongst the Uman, and the conflict is between those forces. So much of our cognitive development isn't in isolation, but rather in relation to each other, and especially as kind of social mammals in relation to what the group thinks, not in a unified or consensual way, but just the presence of another person is often enough to influence how you think and what you do in life. And I really needed these figures in the landscape to influence the main emissary character, not just for our pleasure as viewers, but also for the AIs to kind of bounce off each other, which allows for what they call in computer science for emergence effects. When you have multiple semi-intelligent agents, you inevitably get effects that are more than the sum of their parts, and you really need living characters to do that. So the look of Emissaries was very much inspired by the cartoons of Hayao Miyazaki. He's a Japanese filmmaker. He's made movies like Princess Mononoke, Totoro, Ponyo, Spirited Away. And I very much, what I love in his movies is how carefully he depicts culture and nature with specificity. Nothing in the backgrounds or the foreground are repetitive. They might have similar objects like 5 pigs in a row, but they all have unique faces. And I very much took from this the idea that in computer animation, it's so easy to copy and paste. It's so easy to replicate things that look like they come from each other. And the goal of Emissaries visually was to make it so that everything looked unique, as nature does. When you go in nature, no rock is the same, even though there are billions of rocks. And so every rock in the Emissaries, every face in Emissaries is unique. And I've kind of fused, or wanted to fuse, the disciplines of kind of procedural generation with traditional 3D animation to make unique motion capture, to make unique 3D models, to make unique rocks, plants, and animals as a way of kind of replicating this sort of cartoonish nature. I mention nature a lot in my work because I think it is, when we think about nature, we think about it as a kind of space or a force or a container that's very forgiving. We don't expect of nature complete control. We don't expect of nature total determinism. And I often felt when making my work that I needed that container. I needed to refer to nature in order to make an analogy to, I think, the out-of-controlness that a simulation could contain, and also to speak of the out-of-controlness that we experience in our lives. And I think that nature served as the best entryway or kind of best portal to think about that. You couldn't say a city or an architecture because those are such human things or such deterministic things. So I needed to go into this other thing called nature. So Emissaries is built on this video game engine called Unity. And within that, it's the programming language is called C#, which is often used in video game design. For me, using a technology that's well supported is very important for me as an artist because I'm often cautious about using technology for the sake of it, especially new technologies. For me, often artworks that use really new cutting-edge technologies only can at most become an experiment about the technology itself. And when I made Emissaries, it was in the spirit of that stuff fading away into the background and really foregrounding this feeling that you're watching a culture, you're watching a narrative, and you're watching a kind of extension of nature. And I needed the technology to be well supported and in a way almost invisible. Within art, I think art has a very complicated and conflicted relationship with technology. I think often technology is seen critically from the art perspective, and when it's used, it's often deployed in very tech for tech's sake. But I feel that technology is maybe the one underlying force that really forces us as human beings to consider what the container of human being really is and how much it can stretch or where it will break. When we get technology that allows us to have children outside of the womb, or when we get technology that allows us to clone ourselves, or when we get technology that makes banks irrelevant with blockchain, these force us to reconsider what trust means, what our offspring means, what it means to be a parent. And I think this is this confrontation to these questions and these realities are fundamentally interesting and positive to consider. And for me as an artist, I'd love to consider these questions. It's my passion, it's my joy. If there is a kind of moral dimension to making simulations, to making the emissaries works, is that I'm trying to create simulations where a character is confronted with cataclysmic or little changes, big changes that affect not only themselves but the group. And the central drama, as I think with most drama, is when an individual sees or has a perspective that's different from the group and is forced to either change themselves to align with the group or hold their beliefs steadfast and change the group. And I think if there's any political dimension to my work, it's that maybe embracing certain kinds of change is actually more healthy than not. The hope with a simulation is that it can really occupy the attention across the spectrum. People looking at it for 5 seconds as an image, as an interesting image that they've never seen before, and they've come back multiple times, and they haven't seen that image before or that image before, or for 5 hours where you feel like the way you looking out a window into the park and seeing kids play or squirrels run up the tree. Or you can watch and zone in on 1 or 2 characters and observe the story of their whole life. I really designed these simulations to really mimic nature, in that you could shift your attention like a bird watcher. You could, if you had some knowledge of what you're looking at, you could look at it in one way. If you had no knowledge of what you're looking at, you can also experience the pleasures of this kind of second nature. It's for all kinds of attention spans.